The morning of December 7th, 1941, began like any other in paradise. Warm wind drifted over Oahu, carrying the smell of salt and hibiscus through the barracks of Wheeler Field. Pilots slept, unaware that in a few minutes the sky above them would turn to fire. But somewhere in that calm, a whisper of destiny moved through the air. Two men, young, reckless, and still half-dreaming from a night of cards, would soon hear it first. Kenneth Taylor, 21 years old, tall and sharp-jawed, had joined the Army Air Corps to chase the freedom of the skies. George Welch, his friend and fellow pilot, had a fighter ace's instincts before he'd even seen real combat. They had been stationed at Oahu for less than a year. To them, Hawaii was far from the war that consumed Europe and Asia. It was sun, surf, and training runs, not death. That illusion lasted exactly 7 minutes. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft broke over the island like a dark storm. From the distance came a low hum, hundreds of engines in perfect mechanical unison. Then came the thunder. Explosions ripped across the harbor, steel twisted, and the air itself began to burn. It was not a drill. Taylor and Welch were still in their dress uniforms from the night before, standing outside their quarters when the first bombs fell. Above them, red sun insignias glinted on the wings of the attacking planes, a sight no American had ever seen before. For a brief, breathless moment, both men froze. The world seemed to hang still between peace and apocalypse. Then instinct took over. "Let's get airborne," Taylor shouted. But there was a problem. Their Curtiss P-40 fighters were not at Wheeler Field. They were parked miles away at Halewa Airfield, an auxiliary strip on the northern shore. No radio orders, no escort, no cover. Just 2 men, 2 fighters, and a burning sky between them. They jumped into a Buick and drove like mad through the chaos. The road to Halewa twisted through smoke and debris, columns of black rising from the horizon where battleships burned in Pearl Harbor. Trucks full of soldiers screamed past them, some not yet understanding what was happening. Taylor and Welch didn't speak. There was nothing to say. They both knew they were driving towards something that might end them. When they reached Halewa, the airfield was deserted. The attack hadn't reached this far yet. The silence was almost eerie. Their ground crew had just finished fueling the P-40s. The planes gleamed under the morning sun, waiting, almost aware. They didn't wait for clearance. Taylor climbed into his fighter and slammed the canopy shut. Welch did the same. As their propellers spun to life, dust and sand rose around them like smoke from some ritual fire. They were about to do what no one else in America had done that morning: fight back. As they rolled down the strip, Taylor glanced at the horizon. A glint of silver was already approaching from the south. The Japanese second wave, dozens of fighters, bombers, torpedo planes. Against them, 2 men. The wheels left the ground. The island fell away below. And suddenly, they were in it, climbing straight into the teeth of the invasion. Tracers streaked past like red lightning. The sky roared. Welch's voice crackled through the radio. "There they are. Let's go get 'em." For the next few minutes, the Pacific War was not fought by nations or fleets. It was fought by 2 American pilots against an empire. And somewhere in that chaos, Taylor pulled his plane into an impossible maneuver, rolling upside down through a cloud of enemy fire, firing bursts at bombers that filled the sky like locusts. To the men below, it looked like madness, but in that madness was something new. a move no one had ever trained for, born not of tactics, but survival, instinct, and raw defiance. They didn't know it yet, but this flight, desperate, reckless, and alone, would become the first counterattack of the United States in World War II. And that strange maneuver, that moment of inverted flight through fire, would raise a question that echoes even today. Why did those two men choose to fight that way? And how did that one act change the way America went to war? Before the morning of December 7th, the Pacific Ocean was already trembling with the footsteps of war. For years, Japan's imperial expansion had rolled across Asia like a rising tide. Manchuria had fallen. China was burning. The rising Sun Empire hungered for the oil, steel, and rubber it could no longer buy. Resources locked away by America's embargo. To Tokyo's warlords, diplomacy was no longer an option. The Pacific would be won not by words, but by wings. The Americans, meanwhile, were still dreaming of neutrality. The Great War had scarred them deeply, and across the nation, isolationism was an article of faith. Hawaii was considered a paradise posting, not a front line. Even the men stationed at Pearl Harbor, sailors, mechanics, and young airmen like Taylor and Welch, believed the next war would be fought far away, if at all. But in the quiet rooms of the Japanese Imperial Navy, a different dream was forming, a plan so daring it seemed almost impossible. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, once a student at Harvard and a reluctant warrior, designed it with mathematical precision. If America's Pacific Fleet could be crippled in a single stroke, Japan would have 6 months of freedom, 6 months to conquer the Pacific and build an empire that stretched from Burma to Midway. And for that, they needed a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. That weapon was the A6M-0, the most advanced naval fighter on the planet. Sleek, deadly, and unbelievably agile, it could outturn and outrun nearly every aircraft the Americans had. In mock battles over Japan, the Zero outclassed its opponents so completely that pilots began to describe it as almost supernatural. It could climb at impossible angles, loop and twist like a leaf in a storm, yet carry machine guns and cannons powerful enough to shred a bomber in seconds. Across the ocean, the Americans relied on the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a rugged but heavy machine built for power, not grace. The P-40 could dive like a stone and strike hard, but against the nimble Japanese fighters, it often seemed like a hammer trying to swat mosquitoes. Its armor was thick, its guns deadly, yet its turning radius was a death sentence in a dogfight with a Zero. Still, it had one advantage: speed in a dive, and pilots stubborn enough to use it. By late 1941, the tension was a drumbeat in the Pacific. Reports from intelligence officers hinted that something was coming. Convoys sighted in the North Pacific, code messages intercepted, diplomats behaving strangely. But no one in Washington could imagine a strike so audacious, so far from Japan's shores. The Navy expected sabotage, maybe a raid on the Philippines, not a full-scale assault on Hawaii itself. So when the Japanese fleet slipped from its harbors under radio silence, 6 aircraft carriers hidden in the northern seas, no one saw them coming. And at Wheeler Field, just north of Pearl Harbor, life went on as usual. Pilots trained in formation flights, firing at towed targets, gambling in the evenings, swimming in the warm Pacific by day. They were young, bold, and restless, the kind of men who believed that danger was something that happened to other people. Kenneth Taylor and George Welch were exactly that kind. Both had been assigned to the 47th Pursuit Squadron, two friends united by speed and mischief. They raced jeeps on the runway, buzzed the coastline at low altitude, and mocked the endless drills that seemed to lead nowhere. "We're sitting ducks," Welch once joked, "but at least we'll tan before the war starts." No one laughed when the sirens wailed. When the first bombs fell, American defenses were in chaos. Dozens of aircraft sat lined up wingtip to wingtip on the runways, perfect targets, prepared for sabotage rather than air assault. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled without orders. Radio lines crackled with confusion. The command chain had fractured in the first 2 minutes of battle. For many pilots, the war ended before it began. Their planes were destroyed on the ground. Their only fight was to escape the fire. But for Taylor and Welch, something else awakened. The raw instinct of aviators who refused to wait for permission. They ran not away from the sound of bombs, but toward it. Their decision was more than bravery. It was the first glimmer of a new kind of war. A war where reflex and innovation would matter more than orders. Where airmen would have to invent their survival in real time. And as the Pacific burned, the world was about to learn that history doesn't always begin with strategy or speeches. Sometimes it begins with two young men, a pair of half-fueled planes, and the will to fight when everyone else is still waking up. When the smoke finally began to clear above Pearl Harbor, America's illusion of safety was gone. The Pacific Fleet, once thought invincible, lay crippled in the harbor's waters. Battleships that had been the pride of the U.S. Navy, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, were either sunk or burning wrecks. More than 2,000 Americans were dead, and the enemy had vanished back into the clouds. The shock was absolute. For the first time since the Civil War, the mainland had been touched by war. The newspapers called it infamy. But among the pilots, the word that echoed louder was failure. They had been caught on the ground, outmaneuvered, outflown, and outthought. In the days that followed, as rescue crews pulled bodies from the oil-slick waters and mechanics salvaged what planes they could, a grim truth settled over the surviving airmen. The Japanese were better prepared, better trained, and equipped with machines the Americans barely understood. Pilots who had once joked about weekend wars now stared at the horizon with quiet fear. Reports came in from the Philippines, from Wake Island, from the skies over Malaya. Everywhere, the same pattern repeated. Japanese Zeros dominated the air, cutting down Allied aircraft in devastating numbers. American and British tactics, tight formations, flat turns, slow climbs, were useless against opponents who could twist, climb, and vanish with impossible grace. At Wheeler Field, the survivors gathered among the ruins of their airstrip, their P-40s reduced to smoking skeletons. For Taylor and Welch, the morning's fight was already becoming legend. 2 men against the swarm. Between them, they had shot down at least 6 enemy planes, maybe more. But the cost was sobering. Out of 231 American aircraft on Oahu, nearly half were destroyed. The U.S. Army Air Corps had learned its first lesson in blood. Bravery alone could not win the sky. Behind the heroism, another crisis brewed, a crisis of doctrine. The American system of air combat was built on predictability. Squadrons were trained to follow orders, not instincts. Tactics were written for battles that no longer existed, fights between lumbering bombers, not the lightning-fast dogfights of the Pacific. And now, every pilot who went up against a Zero came down humbled, if he came down at all. Word spread quickly through the Pacific bases. Stories of the Japanese ace Saburo Sakai circulated like ghost tales. He could outturn, outclimb, and outshoot anyone. His Zero, lighter and sharper, could bleed energy from the sky and still rise again. American pilots learned to fear what they couldn't yet counter, an enemy who turned combat into art. Even back in Washington, the high command was paralyzed. Reports from the front contradicted one another. Some officers insisted the Zero was a myth, a trick of morale. Others wanted immediate counterattacks, even with the fleet shattered. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. The United States had entered a modern war with outdated ideas. For men like Taylor and Welch, that truth wasn't theory. It was survival. When they flew that morning, they had no radar, no tactical network, no air control. They fought by sight, by sound, by instinct. They dove when they should have fled, rolled when they should have climbed. Yet somehow, in their defiance, they discovered something raw and new, a different rhythm of combat. But the rest of America hadn't caught up yet. In the following weeks, as the Japanese swept across the Pacific, taking Guam, Hong Kong, the Philippines, U.S. air units tried to apply the old tactics and paid in blood. Entire squadrons vanished in minutes. The P-40s, though tough, were too heavy to keep pace in turning battles. Pilots began to whisper bitter jokes. Don't dogfight a Zero. Just pray it runs out of fuel first. Amid this despair, the image of two young men from Oahu, the only Americans to rise into the air on that Black Sunday, became something larger. It wasn't victory. It was defiance, proof that courage still existed when everything else failed. But behind that legend was a question that no one could yet answer. If the bravest pilots couldn't win by the old rules, what would it take to survive the new war? The skies over the Pacific were changing. The enemy had rewritten the book on air combat, and if the Americans were to stand a chance, someone would have to tear up the old playbook and start again. That someone, in ways no one expected, would come from the same spirit that drove Taylor and Welch into the air, that reckless refusal to die quietly. War, at its most brutal, is also a teacher. And in those first months after Pearl Harbor, the United States was learning the hardest lessons of all. Pilots who survived their first dogfights against the Japanese came back shaken, often silent, their eyes hollow from the realization that they had been outmatched in every possible way. Yet amid that despair, something began to change, a slow, stubborn evolution born from instinct and necessity. It started not in classrooms or command centers, but in the skies themselves, in the seconds between life and death. When Kenneth Taylor and George Welch took off on that Sunday morning, they didn't follow a manual. There were no coordinated formations, no radio commands from headquarters. They fought on pure reaction, the kind of reaction that comes only when you've stopped thinking about survival and started acting from something deeper. They dove steeply through clouds of enemy fire, flipped their P-40s into impossible rolls, and came out shooting from inverted positions, upside down, disoriented, but alive. What had looked like madness was, in fact, revelation. The Curtiss P-40 was heavy and less agile than the Japanese Zero, but it had one hidden strength: sheer speed in a dive. If you stayed high, the Zero would outturn you. But if you dove hard, used gravity as your ally, you could pull away. maybe even strike from below. Taylor and Welch's fight at Pearl Harbor proved that agility wasn't the only weapon in the sky. Momentum could be just as deadly. Their reports spread quickly through the Air Corps. At first, commanders dismissed them. Luck, some said. They got away with it once. But other pilots began to take notice. Those who flew in the Philippines, Burma, and New Guinea started experimenting with similar maneuvers. Fast, slashing attacks from altitude, diving through formations of Japanese planes, and climbing back to safety before the enemy could react. They called it boom and zoom. It was risky, violent, and unorthodox. The pilots who practiced it called it flying like a hammer, striking fast and vanishing before the enemy could catch up. The idea was to turn the P-40's weakness, its weight, into a weapon. A diving Warhawk could hit nearly 400 miles per hour, too fast for a Zero to follow. Instead of dogfighting, American pilots began to use energy tactics, conserving altitude, trading speed for surprise, refusing to play the enemy's game. The first real proof came months later, over the steaming jungles of New Guinea. Pilots of the 49th Fighter Group faced squadrons of Zeros over Port Moresby, and this time they didn't die in circles. They dove from the sun, fired in split-second bursts, and climbed out before the Japanese could react. When the smoke cleared, the Americans were still standing. It wasn't victory yet, but it was survival. And that meant hope. Across the Pacific, a quiet revolution was taking place. Tactical manuals were rewritten. Instructors began teaching the energy fight, altitude as weapon, speed as shield. American pilots stopped trying to outturn the Zero. Instead, they learned to outthink it. Still, the transformation wasn't just mechanical, it was human. War had burned the fear out of the young men who flew these machines. Every mission was a gamble, every sky a grave waiting to open. But those who lived learned something profound. Instinct, when sharpened by desperation, could become strategy. And perhaps that was the real breakthrough. Not a maneuver or a tactic, but a mindset. As for Taylor and Welch, they became symbols of that spirit. The newspapers painted them as heroes, the first Americans to fight back. But the truth was rougher, lonelier. They were pioneers who had glimpsed the new reality of aerial combat before anyone else. A war no longer fought by formations and discipline, but by split-second improvisation. Years later, one of their squadron mates would put it simply, "They taught us that the sky belongs to whoever can stay, one move ahead of death." That lesson spread beyond the P-40. It shaped the development of the P-38 Lightning, the F-6F Hellcat, and eventually the P-51 Mustang, all designed for speed, altitude, and the freedom to attack from above. The Americans had finally learned how to fight the Zero on their own terms. What began as chaos at Pearl Harbor was turning into method. And in the skies of the Pacific, the hunters were beginning to change places with the hunted. By mid-1942, the sound of American engines over the Pacific had changed. Gone was the scattered panic of December, the desperate flailing of men who didn't yet understand their enemy. In its place came a harder, sharper rhythm, disciplined chaos, organized aggression. The United States had learned to fight like the storm it once feared. The new tactics, boom and zoom, high-speed dives, energy fighting, had spread through every airfield in the Pacific. What began with 2 men at Pearl Harbor had become doctrine. Pilots were no longer trying to dance with the Zero. They were hunting it. The first great test came in May 1942 over the Coral Sea. American pilots flying from the carriers Lexington and Yorktown faced off against the Japanese in the first true carrier versus carrier battle in history. For the first time, opposing fleets never saw each other. Only the planes did. Here, the lessons of Pearl Harbor paid off. Dive bombers struck with surgical precision, torpedo planes coordinated attacks under fire, and fighter escorts used their new speed tactics to cover the bombers, instead of engaging in wasteful dogfights. The battle ended in what the newspapers called a strategic victory, but its true success was invisible. The U.S. had stopped the Japanese advance for the first time. 1 month later at Midway, that shift became a revolution. American pilots, using every ounce of what they had learned, surprise, altitude, coordination, found and destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single day. The same fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor was now burning in the same ocean it once ruled. And in that fire, the balance of the Pacific changed forever. But it wasn't just tactics that evolved. It was the pilots themselves. They had become creatures of instinct and endurance, surviving missions that stretched the limits of the human body. Flying 6, 7 hours at a time, they endured suffocating heat, exhaustion, and the endless, haunting possibility of never coming back. Every victory came with a list of names that wouldn't return. For every squadron that learned to outfly the enemy, another was lost to ambush or mechanical failure. The Pacific was merciless, a graveyard for those who hesitated, a proving ground for those who didn't. At bases like Guadalcanal and Port Moresby, the airfields became both home and hell. The men slept beside their planes, oil-stained and sleepless, counting the bullet holes each night and patching them by dawn. Some began to decorate their P-40s with teeth and eyes, symbols of defiance and luck, warding off the fear that tomorrow would be their turn. The flying tigers in China made that look legendary, painting their war hawks with shark mouths and turning the very image of fear into a weapon of morale. They were winning, slowly, brutally, but unmistakably. As the tide turned, something else began to emerge: respect. American pilots, who once cursed the Zero, began to study it, understand it. Captured planes were tested, their secrets revealed. The myth of Japanese invincibility began to fade. Engineers learned how to match its strengths, and more importantly, how to exploit its flaws. And yet, even in victory, the ghosts of Pearl Harbor never left. Kenneth Taylor and George Welch both continued to serve. They fought again in later campaigns, carrying the memory of that morning wherever they went. Welch would go on to become one of the most skilled test pilots in the post-war era, pushing new jets to the edge of what the human body could endure. Taylor, wounded but undaunted, remained a symbol of that defiant first stand, the pilot who rose to meet the impossible. But the true legacy of their flight wasn't just in medals or records. It was in the transformation of an entire air force, from an unprepared garrison to a war machine that learned, adapted, and eventually dominated the skies. The chaos of Pearl Harbor had forced America to evolve faster than it ever had before. It taught its pilots to trust not in manuals, but in creativity, not in orders, but in instinct. Still, the price was written in smoke and names. For every innovation, there was a grave. For every victory, a face remembered only by the men who flew beside him. The Pacific sky, beautiful and endless, became both a battlefield and a monument to those who dared to fight when logic said it was hopeless. By 1943, Japan was no longer advancing. Its once feared zero was being outflown, outbuilt, and outnumbered. But behind every triumph lay the memory of that first Sunday morning, when two young pilots, half-dressed and half-awake, chose to rise into the sky while everyone else sought shelter. Because that's where it all began, the moment when courage turned into knowledge and survival became strategy. History often remembers victories, not beginnings. It tells us about Midway, about the liberation of the Pacific, about the roar of engines over Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But every triumph in that long and terrible war can trace its roots to one morning, one act of defiance, one impossible choice made by two young men who refused to hide when the sky fell. Kenneth Taylor and George Welch never set out to become heroes. They were too young for that word, too reckless, too full of life. When they raced their car through the burning roads of Oahu, they weren't thinking about history. They were thinking about the sound of engines, the pull of flight, the need to fight back, not because they were ordered to, but because their instincts wouldn't allow anything else. In that moment, they embodied something that would come to define the American war effort: the power of initiative. It was the same impulse that would later drive engineers to design faster planes, pilots to invent new tactics mid-fight, and entire squadrons to challenge the impossible odds of the Pacific. Taylor and Welch were not just the first to fight. They were the first to adapt. When the war ended, both men carried their experiences like invisible scars. George Welch went on to test the boundaries of flight itself, becoming one of the first to break the sound barrier, a man forever chasing the horizon. Kenneth Taylor remained in the Air Force for years, his life quieter, but no less marked by what he had seen. When asked later how it felt to be one of the first Americans to fight in World War II, he only shrugged. "I was just doing what needed to be done." But behind that simplicity was a truth too large to fit in medals or speeches. Their story wasn't just about bravery, it was about transformation, about how, in moments of terror, the human spirit can invent its own survival, about how innovation, born from chaos, can turn disaster into destiny. The tactics that Taylor and Welch improvised in desperation became the seeds of a new era of air combat, one that would carry forward into Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Every pilot who rolled his fighter into a dive to gain speed, every ace who struck from the sun and vanished again, carried a piece of that morning with him. And yet, beyond the strategy and science, there is something quieter that lingers. The image of two fighters rising alone against the dawn, not as symbols of invincibility, but as proof of something more fragile and human. The refusal to surrender even when the outcome is certain. The fields of Wheeler and Halewa are peaceful now. The palm trees sway where hangars once burned. Tourists walk the beaches, the sky above them calm and blue. But if you stand there at sunrise, just as the light touches the horizon, it's easy to imagine it. The distant hum of two engines, climbing, defiant, into the heart of history. Because courage isn't always victory. Sometimes it's simply the choice to rise when the world tells you to fall.